Okay, so some things to think about when you're deciding whether or not you want to float the guy. First off is the quality of the opponent. Now, we generally have a few different generic types of opponents. We got really good players. We got kind of average players. We got fish. We have nits who are extremely very tight. Now, the good players, of course, the real strong, tight, aggressive regulars. These are the guys you don't want to float all that often. Now, you certainly want to float them, but you don't want to do it maybe as much as you would like a weak regular. The reason being is because if you start calling a ton of flops against these guys, they're gonna adjust pretty quickly and start double barreling you, and then your floats become more or less unprofitable. So you can't float them too much because they're gonna pick up on it pretty quickly. The other problem with these guys is they're good at being just nice and aggressive in general, and just as a result of that, these guys are going to be two barreling a lot. So they often will kind of or automatically have a game plan that makes floating a little bit harder to make profitable against them. So be careful about floating real good players, and these are also guys who can get creative and check raise, bluff the turn, and really get creative and fight back. So they're tougher to make a float profitable against. So you want to be careful when you pull it out against them, and you really want to make sure that the situation is good for it. My favorite people to float are weak regulars. These are the guys who, maybe they're break even, maybe they're winning at a small win rate. They probably make a ton of money in rake back. They very often will play, 12 or even 15 tables. And these guys are pretty much prime candidates to float, in my opinion, simply because, their game just isn't as strong it's not as aggressive as some of the better players. And they also will often play a ton of tables because they're collecting a lot of rakebacks. So that means they're not really tuned into what's going on in any one table. They don't really know what the dynamic is. They haven't really been paying a whole lot of attention. They're looking at your HUD stats a lot. And as a result, these guys will often, they'll raise pre-flop, they'll make their C-bet, and if they encounter any resistance, they'll often just give up. So these are guys that can be really profitable to float, when you pick the right board texture, because they're just not going to double barrel you as a bluff all that often, and they become very exploitable in that sense. And the float is a really great tool to exploit them. So they often will not give you a whole lot of trouble, and they'll make their C bet, you'll call, they'll check, you bet, they fold. Pretty straightforward. So these guys are excellent guys to be floating. Now some fish are good to be floating too, but not all of them, of course. Fish come in many varieties, and the ones you want to be floating are the ones that tend to play more fit or fold poker, the ones that really aren't that aggressive, and the ones that generally don't have huge win to showdowns. A lot of them will just have like 40%, just astronomical win to showdowns. Clearly, if the guy isn't going to fold, then there's no point in trying to bluff him, right? So the float is kind of not applicable against people like that. But some of them will just play fit or fold, and their hand ranges are pretty predictable. They'll play any ace, they'll play any king. So you just you pick a board maybe that's like a jack high board, or or maybe like a 9 high board or something, and floats will often work well against them because these guys aren't thinking about like hand ranges. They're not really thinking, well, my ace high has equity against his range. Instead, they're thinking, well, I only have ace high, I'm going to fold, or something along those lines. It's often hard to get inside some of these guys' minds, but pay attention to the guy's actual tendencies, and don't just say, oh, he's a fish, I'm not going to bother floating if he's not going to fold. Because, you'll miss a lot of good spots. But at the same time, just, approach it with caution, and, be realistic about how fishy he is and in what way is he fishy. So, and also don't do it on ace high boards, just because, like I just said, these guys play every ace, and they're never going to fold an ace. So they're never going to fold a pair of aces. So I would strongly urge you not to even try it. Okay, so nits. Okay, nits can be pretty good candidates to float. The problem with these guys is that these are the type of guys you see playing like a 15 or a 16 VPIP in a 6-max game. So they're real tight, and often the move against these guys can be to bluff raise them. But the float is important too. The problem you're going to run into is that their hand range is just so strong on average because they don't play any hands. They don't play any weaker hands. That you're going to run into, you're going to get two barreled a lot just because their range is good, and they're also pretty good about, they're generally pretty good about two barreling to kind of balance their other two barreling tendencies when they actually have a hand. But nonetheless, these guys are tight. These guys don't like uh, playing marginal hands. Excuse me. And as a result, if it looks like they're giving up on a board, they're probably giving up on it. So, keep your eyes open for sure. I mean, you'll definitely find some spots against these guys. So another really, really important consideration is board texture. Let's look at a few different types of boards. First one is, this is just basically what I've called a polarizing board. It basically means your opponent either has a hand or he doesn't. So, for example, king deuce deuce. All right, no good players. Good players have almost no deuces in their range unless they're playing exactly 2-2, in which case they flop quads, good for them. But they have almost no twos in their range. So in this situation, if they bet, let's say they open in the cutoff and we call on the button, right? And the flop's king 2-2. They lead into us, we float them, and on the turn, they can either double barrel their heir or their king, or they can check, and if we bet, they have to just pretty much give up. I mean, like, they either have it or they don't. A lot of good players will, and this is where you have to, again, think about the type of opponent. But if a weak regular checks this turn, and the turn's a 3 or 4, some non-issue card, it doesn't really even matter, actually, and we pot it, I mean, he's going to go away. He's going to fold just so often. So those are really great boards to float, simply because it's a situation where he either has it or he doesn't. So it becomes an easier situation to analyze. Now another great spot is like a real scary board where when you make a call on, like, in the cutoff or on the button, a lot of people are ready to put you on a range that's heavy in, like, suited connectors, pocket pairs, things like that. And so when the board comes down something like 4-5-6 or 4-5-7, and he bets and we call, and the turn is like another connecting card, like another 7 or a 9 or an 8 or a 6, or something that makes this board look real scary. These are perfect situations to float him with Queen Jack or something like that, or King Jack or whatever, or pocket twos, simply because he's not really going to be able to continue. I mean, we called the flop. We're representing a lot of equity. We're representing the fact that maybe we were drawing, maybe we had a made hand, maybe we had a pair plus draw. There are just so many different ways for him to be beat with even a pretty good hand, that even with a hand like as strong as like pocket jacks, I mean, what's he going to do when we float a flop like this and another connecting card comes down and we start firing? He's just not in a very good situation. So these can be really good, and he's definitely going to get rid of a hand like ace high. So these can be really good situations where it doesn't look like a double barrel is going to do anything for him, and the board just got a lot scarier, and it looks like it hit our hand range in his eyes. So those can be real good. Another one is just kind of a draw heavy board in general. If like there's a straight draw and a flush draw out there, and he bets, we can float him with just about anything. And if one of those 15 outs rolls off, it's pretty believable. And he checks the turn. We can just go ahead and pot it, and it's going to look pretty convincing that we got there. And the bottom line is, he really has to have a hand to continue, and that's kind of the whole idea in general. Is we're exploiting his c-bet, and we are forcing him to show up with a hand. So representing a draw can be another really good way to do it. Okay, and the other thing is there's going to be a lot of combos of draws in our range, and if he's at all thinking, he's going to realize that and not realize that there's a whole lot he can do against it.